Welcome. I'm Checker Finn with the Fordham Institute. Our session this morning, which we've called Weighing the Waivers, is beginning for those of you with us in Washington today and those watching via the internet. Those in the studio audience, welcome and thanks for coming. And let me remind you that there's literature to pick up on the way in, and that you should have with you a piece of paper that identifies the panelists. So we're not going to spend time in elaborate introductions. I will note that Michelle McNeil is from Education Week. Mike Petrilli is from the Fordham Institute, our agent provocateur in residence. Carmel Martin is from the Department of Education. And Jeremy Ayers is from the Center for American Progress. And they are all knowledgeable observers, commenters, and participants in the ESEA waiver process, and we are very glad that they are with us to explore this topic today. For those watching over the internet and anybody that wants to pass the word along, there's a live broadcast, but it's also being recorded and will be on our website ASAP. If you're watching online and you want to ask questions of the panelists when we get to that part of the program, you can email them to questions@edexcellence.net. That's questions@edexcellence.net. And I'm told that we have a Twitter feed, which if I am, we're way beyond my technology here, which if I'm reading this correctly is #WeighingWaivers. Let me also mention, just as a little Fordham commercial, that an entire collection of 5 terrific papers on digital learning and the policy obstacles to successful digital learning is now available on our website, www.edexcellence.net. We are not starting with opening remarks. We're starting directly with questions. And the first question is for Carmel, because she is here on behalf of the administration that did all this. And the opening softball question is, what did you do and why did you do it?
Thanks.
I think you're live.
Thanks, Checker.
Yes.
It's great to be here this morning. Thanks to Fordham for putting this together. So basically what we did is we said to states across the country that if they were interested in moving to the next generation of reform in terms of accountability and teacher quality, that we would offer them flexibility around some current law provisions that we felt were getting in the way of states' desire to move to a next generation of reform in those 2 areas. So we offered them the opportunity to come in and request that flexibility. We had 11 states that came in our first round. All 11 states' applications requests have been approved. And just this week we received an additional 27, I think is the final tally. So we're really excited about what we did. I urge you to take a look. All of the information with respect to the 11 states is on our website. We see 11 different states with pretty different theories of action in terms of how they're going to get better results for students and improve the quality of instruction in their states. But they are all consistent with some core principles that we thought were important to carry forward. The Secretary said many times that he thought NCLB did a lot of good things in terms of education reform, particularly in the area of saying that all kids matter and that it's not just about raising performance of all kids, but looking at closing gaps and looking at the performance of individual subgroups of students. So we tried to keep that core principle that we thought was really important, but help states move forward in how they get there. And I think that what you see is some pretty interesting stuff that will be models moving forward, and hopefully will, as the Secretary often says, help inform the legislative process, which we have not given up on. We think that the law should be reauthorized, and we have worked very closely with Congress to try to make that happen, and we'll continue that work. But in the meantime, we just heard the call from the field, parents, teachers, principals, superintendents, governors, state superintendents, that the law was very long overdue, and they were moving forward with or without us. So we're excited about this partnership with states and local leadership to be able to do that.
Okay, so before we get into the merits or unmerits of the waivers and the waiver process, can we talk again about the sort of statutory basis for it? When the White House announced this in September, the White House press secretary said, or the White House publication said, quote, states can request flexibility, but only if they are transitioning students, teachers, and schools to a system aligned with college and career-ready standards for all students, comma, developing differentiated accountability systems, comma, and undertaking reforms to support effective classroom instruction and school leadership. So the only ifs, we understand that the Secretary has waiver authority to avoid or suspend or give people freedom from statutory requirements. But where do the only ifs come from? In terms of legal underpinning?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're familiar with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, those things are very deeply ingrained in the law that's at issue in this context. The legal authority that we have to waive specific provisions of the law says that the Secretary can do that if he believes that what the state is proposing to do would be will lead to improved outcomes for kids and improved instruction. So those parameters that you laid out, Checker, that are accurate, are closely aligned to both of those standards that were set out by the United States Congress, not by the President and not by the Secretary. The Congress gave the Secretary the authority to figure out how he was going to come up with a way for measuring whether what the state wanted to do instead of the federally required provisions would improve instruction and improve outcomes for students. As I'm sure you all know, a core component of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act is this idea of having standards-based reform. So to say that we will waive existing requirements in exchange for a commitment to even better, higher standards that are meaningful for students, and to waive requirements around teacher quality in exchange for a commitment to move to a more, we think, more efficient, meaningful system of measuring teacher quality, we think makes a lot of sense. As a matter of fact, the states themselves thought it made a lot of sense. When we laid out our principles for the flexibility package, we think we were very consistent with the principles that were laid out by the chief state school officers, who are the people who are charged at the state level with figuring out what an accountability system should look like. So, I think as a matter of law, we were clearly within our legal authority here. We had precedent that we were following. The previous administration had done this twice. And had also laid out criteria by which states could apply for that flexibility. Mike has argued that our scope is much broader than her scope. That's, I think, a fair distinction between the two, but that doesn't really change the legal authority that we're operating under and that she's operating under. And I think more importantly, what we're seeing is that the states, what the parameters that we laid out were parameters that states also wanted to move forward on. This was not us coming up with some disconnected policy agenda in order to get flexibility over here. You need to do these other disconnected things. The things we asked them to do to have a system of differentiated support intervention is essentially what the objective of No Child Left Behind was. So we're saying if you can come up with a more effective way of doing that than Congress decided upon 10 years ago, we're going to let you do that. Likewise, the law had provisions around teacher quality, and we basically said to them, if you want to move to a more effective way of getting at that issue, we'll give you flexibility with the current law. And standards is so deeply ingrained in the accountability system that we also thought that if you were willing to move to higher standards, it's easier for us to say that your new plan would be better for kids and lead to more effective instruction.
So, Michelle, you've been watching this for a long time. Just situate this whole thing in sort of the context of federal education policy. Was this a result to a groundswell of unhappiness? Was this something out of left field or whole cloth by the administration? From where you sit, why did this happen?
So as the 2014 deadline for 100% proficiency is quickly approaching, states were, I think, starting to freak out about all the growing list of schools that were continuing to not make adequate yearly progress. And so I think what we saw was a clamoring for a reauthorization or some sort of way to deal with this 100%, this perfection that we were all seeking several years ago, that we ended up not being able to make good on. So I think states were clamoring to do something. I think the department wanted to do something for states. President Obama has made it somewhat of a political issue by framing it in terms of that we can't wait for Congress to act. So I think there was a little bit of politics involved there. So I think it was a lot of different things. And the waiver authority in the legislation is very broad, and I don't know, and I think Carmel makes a really strong argument for the legal authority to do it and why they did it. And, furthermore, I wonder if people expected them to waive things without asking for anything in return. So, I think it was fair to do that. So I guess it was a combination of many things.
Have you been surprised by how many states have applied, or is this what you expected to happen?
No, I thought a lot of states would apply. I think states wanted out of the requirements to provide tutoring and choice. States wanted to resolve conflicts between their dueling. A lot of them had two accountability systems running. They had their own kind of statewide accountability system, like Florida had an A through F system, and then there was this NCLB system that sometimes resulted in conflicting outcomes, and people were confused, and so I think it resolves that in some ways. So no, I'm not surprised. I'll be interested to see in the end who does not apply for a waiver and what happens to them.
So we're up to what? 38 now, at least applied and or approved. Is that right? 27 new ones and 11. Okay, 38 out of. Okay. Let me tug on one thread you just mentioned in passing, though, which was states not wanting to have to provide tutoring or choice. To what extent is the state unhappiness with NCLB just they're making us do things we don't want to do, as opposed to they're making us do things we can't do?
Oh, I think that's a big part of it. Clearly this flexibility turns a lot of the power back over to states. They can design their own interventions. They can decide in some ways within certain parameters who gets targeted for interventions and who doesn't. That being said, a couple states are planning to keep some portion of SES and choice. It hasn't gone away completely, but I think effectively it has. So yes, I don't think most people like to be told what to do.
No?
No.
Everybody at Fordham loves it.
Right, checker.
So
or so they say.
I think states are getting to call more of their own shots this way.
So Jeremy, you all at CAP did an elaborate analysis of the first 11 applications and published it before Christmas, as I recall. Mm-hmm. And to my astonishment, you admitted today that you haven't yet analyzed the 27 that came in this week. So shame on you. But,
Indeed.
But when I looked at your analysis of the first 11, I guess this was before they were approved, but while they were after they'd been submitted, you had a fair number of mildly phrased criticisms of the unevenness of them. And so what I want to get at is whether flexibility, which is likely to lead to things being different from place to place, leads to a worrisome kind of unevenness, or is it a desirable kind of a variety, or some of each?
Right. I can imagine that it's both. Sometimes, the cliche is the devil you know is better than the one you don't know. And I think for all the complaining about NCLB, one of the consistent things about it, at least, was that there was some commonality across states about how we measure progress and what it is that we're looking for. So when states came in with applications that want to consider 10 different factors in how they're evaluating schools, there's some positives and there's some negatives about that, and I think that's what you saw in our piece that we were reacting to. Absolutely, I think it's important for states to have some flexibility around how it is that they're identifying their schools that are low performing and what they want to do to improve them. At the same time, we have some states that have so many factors that it's difficult to tell exactly how they're determining which schools are low performing, and then what in the world you're going to do about it to improve them. So I think that's why you have a lot of states moving to sort of this A to F system so the public can understand it a little bit better. But when you have 15 different factors, where do you start to improve your school? How do you make that information actionable for not only your school, but your parents and for your public? So I think that's a little bit about where we were coming from with that. And it's the chance, it's the risk, it's the opportunity you have with any sort of innovation and flexibility. And so we think it's going to be incumbent on the department to hold a high bar to ramp up in their monitoring and their oversight, but also for states to keep their promises and to keep their word. And we think that that's something that's going to be incumbent also on outside groups like ours, like others, to ensure that that happens.
So let me read you one of your paragraphs.
Please do.
Kentucky would norm all schools. Low-performing schools must then improve by 1/5 of a standard deviation annually for 5 years in order to reach the 70th percentile. New Mexico would take 6 years to get every school up to the level of the top 10% of schools, as defined by a base year norming of schools. So if I'm reading this correctly, and I know nothing about the Kentucky or New Mexico applications, Kentucky aimed for the 70th percentile over 5 years for all of its schools, and New Mexico aimed for what sounds like the 90th percentile over 6 years for all of its schools. Is this good or bad for the children of Kentucky and New Mexico? Is it realistic on the part of the education authorities in Kentucky and New Mexico?
Right. Some of this is a statistical question, and so I might actually punt that a little bit to some statisticians.
We don't have
I think
any
one
at
of the
the table.
question I
Maybe
would ask,
Carmel.
right? Absolutely. So one of the questions I think we were asking in that is when you're using basically you're comparing your students across the state, and we're saying here's the average. So the example I like to use actually better is Colorado.
Okay.
So Colorado ranked all of their schools, and they said what's the average rate of growth in the year 2009, 2010, and what we're going to do is try to get our students up to the average rate of growth. We raised the question about if Colorado doesn't have a high rate of growth, is that really an adequate goal or not? You obviously don't just want growth, you want growth to standard or growth to proficiency. So I think the question we were at least trying to raise while punting to the not yet present statistician is, one, are these goals clear? And two, are they actually ambitious? And to me, it's a question that's on the table, and it's not just a question about what's on paper, it's also a question about implementation and how these states will live up to what they said they would do.
It's sort of this kind of thing comes across to me as sort of a mishmash. It may be consistent within the state, but it's certainly inconsistent from state to state. Is that what flexibility? Back to you, Carmel. Was that what flexibility was expected to produce? Was inconsistency from state to state?
I don't think it was designed to create inconsistency, but it was very much designed to allow state and local actors to take greater ownership over how the progress would be measured. What we're trying to get is consistency about what success looks like, and that's what drives our desire to support states' movement towards college and career-ready standards. But in terms of how you then take the multitude of information we have about how schools are doing, how students are doing, how districts are doing, how states are doing, and figure out when you're going to call a school an A school versus an F school, or whether you're even going to do it versus A, B, C, D, E, F. Many of these states did not adopt a traditional A through F grading system. They decided to tackle it differently. Mm-hmm. But that allowing states to shape that system in a way that they could own and that they could allow their local context to inform was very much our objective. So flexibility was a high-level objective, but at the same time we said, we'll let you do flexibility, but it's our legal obligation to ensure that in doing that you continue to protect kids So we did bring in psychometricians, not statisticians, but psychometricians, to look at these rates of progress as well as other factors in the flexibility requests. And we did ask them to demonstrate to us that their goals were rigorous, that they didn't have to be the same, but that they were similarly rigorous. And we feel good about these 11 states. We think that they have gone about the methodology of goal setting in extraordinarily different ways. I mean, I think Jeremy's point to Colorado, if you look at that compared to what many states did, which is cut proficiency gaps in half, which is much more simple than Kentucky's standard deviation or Colorado's looking at rates of growth over time. They're very different methodologies, but we do have mechanisms for ensuring that their expectations for their state, for their districts, and for their schools, and then by association for their children, are similarly aggressive, and we think that's a good thing. And we think trying to get the balance right between not resting on your laurels but not having such high expectations that the system finds the goals meaningless was another objective for us, and we found an objective of these 11 states.
But talk about a mishmash, at least in where I come from. No, I've never met two psychometricians who agree with each other about anything. You don't have to respond to that. Mike, for the last 5 minutes, we've been talking about sort of the inconsistency that flexibility may have produced from place to place, but your contention the last few weeks has been that flexibility didn't actually produce much flexibility, and that it actually kept states in a kind of a new straitjacket, not to put words in your mouth. Do you want to give us your perspective on what flexibility has or has not yielded?
Sure. First of all, there's still donuts over there, everybody, and you should go get some. So, yeah. Unless you're watching online, in which case you have to get your own donuts wherever you are. So Carmel is certainly right, and I respect what the department has done in terms of saying that the Secretary has the right to set the parameters around flexibility. And Margaret Spellings, when she was Secretary of Education, provided flexibility such as around growth models, and she was very clear about what she would agree to and what she would not agree to, how far she was willing to go. She, for example, said growth models are okay, but I want to see growth to proficiency, as Jeremy said, not just growth for the sake of growth. Now, that's a case of saying, here is the flexibility that we're willing to provide, here's the waiver, and here are the parameters. I think what's very different is saying, here's the flexibility we're going to provide, and these are conditions attached to that flexibility, a quid pro quo. So, and to be clear, I like the idea of college and career-ready standards. I like the idea of rigorous teacher evaluations. I like the idea of differentiated accountability. The question is whether those things are grounded enough in the law. So, there's nothing in the law, as far as I can see, that says states are expected to have college and career-ready standards. That's something that's, newer in the past 10 years that we've been thinking about since the law passed. It makes a lot of sense. It's pragmatic. But is there the legal authority to tell states, you must do this if you want this flexibility? I think that's where there's some legal questions. I continue to think that if a state applied, let's say Texas applied, and said, we are not going to fill out this part of the application where you ask about college and career-ready standards, and the department said no because of that, I think there could be a lawsuit, and I think the department would lose it. All right, set that aside.
I would point out there's nothing about 3 years of growth to standard or growth in the law either, which was the Spellings.
Right. But this is the distinction, Carmel, is that's a parameter versus a condition. Okay, that's saying, here's how far we're willing to go.
I would say that's semantics.
Well, I don't know. We'll leave that to the lawyers.
Well, wait a minute. We already need statisticians. Now we also need lawyers
and psychometricians.
Is anybody going to bring in a physician to check on our
heart
rate?
We will get there. All right. Now, the Secretary had every right to set parameters around flexibility. And so in the end, for example, he said no to some of the things the states wanted to do. So for example, super subgroups, more or less, they ended up saying no to, or at least not quite as the states wanted.
Help the audience. What is a super subgroup?
Well, and again, others can wade in here.
What a subgroup is. What is a super subgroup?
So the super subgroup idea
was
a
super PAC?
You're right, like a super PAC. And a little bit like Superman. This is the idea, and we can get into the details a little bit later, that says, for all the good No Child Left Behind has done on identifying the performance of subgroups, poor, minority kids, special ed, ELL, By looking at each group individually in terms of the accountability system, it created a very mechanistic system. And it created some perverse incentives for schools to worry about things like, okay, if we can get 2 more African-American kids over this bar, then we'll be okay. Rather than having a more holistic approach that says, basically, we want schools to make sure they're paying attention to their neediest kids, their low-achieving kids, and not just looking at overall averages. So if you're a diverse school and your middle-class kids or your white kids, your high-achieving kids are doing well and the other kids aren't, you can't be considered a good school. So the states wanted some flexibility with how that could work. For example, in Florida, for a long time in their accountability system, they've said, we're not going to make it race-based explicitly. We're going to say that every school, we're going to look at the bottom 25% of your performance spectrum, the lowest achieving kids, and we want to see that they are making significant growth over the course of the year. Now, many of those kids, because of our achievement gaps and such, are poor. Many of them are minority. Many are special ed and ELL, but it wasn't explicitly looking at those subgroups. And so, now the secretary has basically said, I don't think that's enough. I still want to see these data broken out by subgroup and the accountability linked to the individual subgroups. He has every right to do that. Where I disagree, though, is in the rhetoric that the secretary has used and the president has used, and some people on the Hill have used, saying we are in favor of flexibility. We are handing this back to the states. We are really opening the way for states to take ownership of their systems. And at least when it comes to identifying the schools that are failing or not, when it comes to rating the schools, the sort of A to F system, there was still a lot of constraints that the Department of Education put in. And there were a lot of things that the states proposed that I found to be quite reasonable that the Department of Education said no to. Now, there's 2 issues. One is the debate about whether these things were reasonable or not. So let's debate, for example, whether it makes sense in the Florida system to just pay attention to the bottom 25% of kids in each school rather than breaking it out by those racial subgroups or those other subgroups. The other debate, though, is a federalism debate, which is, at the end of the day, who should make that decision? And should that be the folks in Florida who decide whether or not that's the right approach, or should it be the folks at 400 Maryland Avenue? Now, again, Arnie, Duncan, Carmel have every right to decide how far they're willing to go. But I would argue that they didn't end up going as far as the rhetoric implies. And as a result, I think we have less innovation going forward around accountability than we otherwise would. And particularly when we get into the reauthorization debate, what I worry about is if we have new straitjackets, if we have new constraints that seem to make sense right now, that we're going to regret that 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, because we're going to have new ideas about how to do this better, but we're going to have hemmed ourselves in.
I want to go on the record, though, I think, as saying Mike Petrilli wants it both ways, and you can't have it. You were just criticizing the department for saying you want them to hew to or stay close to the law. There's nothing more fundamental to No Child Left Behind than ensuring that every single subgroup meets high standards and that there's accountability for making sure that they do. And I think that's where there's some concern among civil rights groups about backtracking on that. So if anything, the department should be commended for holding states to a high bar around subgroup accountability. There's nothing more fundamental to federal education policy than equity, and there's nothing more fundamental than subgroup accountability to NCLB. Now, we can debate about what's the best way to do that, but for the department to hold the line on that is them in keeping with the law and in keeping with the equity provisions of the federal role. I think that's why a lot of groups would commend them for that.
And that's fine. We just shouldn't pretend that that's significant flexibility. I mean, what many states are doing is looks more like AYP than I think the department has implied. And so we should admit that. We haven't totally gotten rid of AYP. We've adjusted AYP. We're kind of somewhere between AYP and what the states really wanted to do.
If I get on the subgroup issue, the department these super subgroups are still very much a part of a lot of these states' grading systems. And the department allowed them, Florida, Indiana, New Mexico, Massachusetts, a lot of these states all have these super subgroups. And these super subgroups, and the department is allowing them to do this, are still very much an important part of these new accountability systems. And civil rights groups are worried about that. Yes, the states still have to report data by these individual small subgroups, and they factor in somewhat, in driving interventions. But in a lot of these states, these super subgroups are the most important, I guess, factor when looking at subgroups. So, yes, I think the department still wants reporting disaggregated by individual subgroups, but individual subgroups, I think, largely are no longer driving this accountability train in some of these states. I don't know if Carmel thinks I'm overstating it, but I think these super subgroups are playing a much more important role than they had in the past.
So there were, first of all, I hate the term super subgroup. I don't know where it came from. I find myself using it and trying to stop myself. So just for those who are less familiar with these 11 states' applications than the folks here on the panel, 2 of the 11 stuck with the identifying, disaggregating data based on the qualities that No Child Left Behind provided for, which is race, ethnicity, poverty status, disability status, and English learner status. 9 of the 11 added to the equation the concept of a new subgroup. In some of those states, about half of those remaining states, what that looked like is what Mike just described. They looked at the lowest performing students, regardless of what other characteristics that student had. The concept was, if you're in the bottom quartile of performance, then we should be watching that. And to create, I would argue it is a very positive development because it was used as a tool to create this concept of continuous improvement. Schools have to be, regardless of what group the student belongs to, if they're in the bottom quartile, how can we help making sure that we're constantly bringing their performance up? Some states didn't do it that way. They combined the other subgroups, usually along the lines of they identified them based on their historical underperformance or historical lack of attention to those groups. We think this is a very positive development.
Being having both kinds, having both approaches.
Either version we think can be an extremely positive development for kids because for 2 reasons. One is we found that what these states were trying to do was not to duck accountability for the individual subgroups, but rather to create a more effective system of accountability to raise up the performance of all kids and close gaps. They're usually used in an attempt to get an added dimension that didn't exist under No Child Left Behind at gap closing. So we think it was a positive thing. That said, we also could appreciate why the civil rights groups and other stakeholders were concerned, nervous that what we were going to end up with was what we had prior to No Child Left Behind, which was individual groups of students' performance would be ignored because a larger subgroup would mask their performance. So what we tried to do, all 9 that proposed this, we think innovation in accountability systems, we're allowed to keep it. And in all 9, it is an extremely core part of their accountability system. So I think you're just wrong, Mike, in your assessment that we rejected it. We did not reject it. But what we did is work with those states to say, okay, we want to enable you to move forward with this innovation, but it's our legal obligation to make sure that if English learners are ignored year after year after year in a school, that's not okay. So you tell us, not we tell you, you tell us how you're going to add a dimension to your system that makes sure that you are going to take responsibility for ensuring that in moving to this new system that English learners or students with disability or Hispanic students or poor students don't get left behind, don't get lost in the shuffle. And if you look at these applications, you'll see they all went at that in very different ways. We provided them technical assistance to give them suggestions on ways to go at that, but they ended up in very different places, and we think that's something to be celebrated. And we also think it's a great example of how the federal government can protect kids, but at the same time respect state and local actors' desire to figure out how to do it their way, not our way. So I think this is a key example of how we were able to respect what states wanted to do, allow for innovation, but still at the same time not skirt our obligation to protect kids and not allow states and districts and schools to skirt their obligation to protect kids. So we think it's a great thing.
Yeah, and I understand where you were coming from, Carmel, but just again the semantics. I mean, so did the department reject? If the state said we'd like to use super subgroups or whatever you want to call it alone, and the department said no, you must add these other components. So I don't know if that's a rejection or not.
Most of these states did not. Most of these states, I can think of only 2. Most of these states were retaining the NCLB subgroups. There were very few of these states that did not keep the disaggregation by the characteristics outlined in No Child Left Behind. And what we tried very hard to do, and we were successful at, is to not say no, to say, let's figure out how we can respect your theory of action. That's how we approached this entire process. States came to us with different theories of action, and I can give you some examples of how divergent those theories of action are. But we said, how can we help you keep your theory of action but still ensure that you're protecting kids? Because if we can't do that, we don't have the legal authority to give you the flexibility to do it this other way.
So, Michelle, she's using soft verbs like help you and work with you and stuff like that. Others would say strong arm. Others would say negotiate. From where you sat and observed, what did any states, and give examples if you wish to, what did states seek that they didn't get? What kind of flexibilities, if any, were states wanting that the department wouldn't let them have? Do you know?
So I have a couple examples. However, I will say if any of you have tried to read the 11 applications to understand exactly what they were asking for, and then to go back
Isn't
and
that how you spent New Year's Eve?
I did read them all, but
You did, yes.
I do know Indiana was one state, and Carmel can correct me if I'm wrong, but Indiana wanted to ignore the individual traditional NCLB subgroups completely, and the department said no, you have to at least report the data. That's what Indiana told me.
I believe they were always planning to report the data.
Okay.
I could be
That's a
wrong.
fundamental part of the application. So
they were always
had
going to report it, but it
and to set goals, right? So the question is not whether or not
they
you're
did
not going to pay
have
attention, right?
goals by the NCLB.
So states were also, I guess I'd rather answer, like, what did states have to change in between when they applied and when they were approved?
That is as a result of working with. Go ahead.
Right. So however you want to, whether they were strong-armed and, But first of all, states' applications were really weak when it came to describing how they were going to make sure college and career-ready courses were available to ELLs and students with special education. Those were, I think, pretty weak parts of the application. And I think the department came back and said, we want to know more about this. We want to know more about how you're going to prepare teachers to teach these kids. Secondly, I think the department had states factor in graduation rates into their accountability systems more in some states than some states had originally proposed. So graduation rates, I think, in some states became more prominent after the department was done. We've already talked a little bit about the subgroup issue and then setting annual goals. The department wanted to see annual goals. Also, one requirement of the waiver application was that the states were supposed to consult with stakeholders, unions, those in the disability community, ELL. And I'm not sure that all states, and some of this was because of the rapid turnaround time. I think states had 6 weeks, 2 months, 7 weeks to do these applications on the first round. And I don't think that collaboration was there. So you saw in some, the acceptance letters or whatever, that some states committed to do a little bit more collaboration, especially in that teacher element. So I don't know how the department's going to monitor that collaboration or what, but so I think the department also wants to encourage that collaboration going forward. So those were some areas that come to mind.
Okay.
Right away.
I'd like to add one thing. We thought it was really interesting in looking at the first round of waivers. The fourth principle that almost no one talks about was for states to provide to reduce duplication, to reduce the burden, to streamline their policies and their regulations. It's exactly, I think, what Mike's, how can we give more freedom and flexibility to our locals, to our districts, and to our schools? And although the department did not put rubrics in the application, almost no state addressed that in detail. There were some states like New Jersey and Florida who already have laws on the books or already had a commission looking at these things. But here was an opportunity to unleash this creativity that we think the federal government is holding states and districts back from, and there wasn't a lot in there. Now, again, it may be that the department didn't put a lot of rubrics in the application, but here's an opportunity to sort of really push forward on the flexibility piece, and there was not a lot there. So I think this idea that somehow the federal government is standing in the way of this incredible creativity at the state and local level is a little bit of a myth. Certainly there are ways we can right-size the federal role or things like that. that, but it seems to me in the application that was the reverse, something that states were invited to do, and they didn't really seem to take the invitation, at least in detail.
No, and that's consistent with what happened under No Child Left Behind, where there were some flexibility provisions that weren't used much or at all. I think what we learned, though, and what we've learned over the 10 years, is that what states really want flexibility around is how they design their accountability systems. And so that's why, that's where the heart of the matter is. How do you rate schools? What goes into that?
But wasn't it interesting when Margaret Spellings offered the pilot around around differentiated accountability? My sense is, because I'm a little bit younger than other folks, so this was, I didn't pay as much attention then, but the common word on the street.
Right at me.
No.
No, he was in fourth grade. His school was in need of improvement.
That's right. Indeed. And I welcome the attention to my subgroup in my school. Is that states didn't come up with anything that terribly different than what they already had. I think a lot reversed the order of choice or supplemental services. So I think that the waivers actually show there's a great deal of innovation that's out there, far more than we've had before. But this idea, again, that I think is a myth, that the federal government is standing in the way of this incredible creativity among states and districts, sometimes that may be merited, but in this case, I don't think it is.
All right. Well, can I give one more example? Michelle mentioned annual goals. Okay. Now, this is another thing that sounds like it makes perfect sense, and for many of these systems, it does. You want to see more growth every year. But take my understanding of how the Colorado system is designed, or at least what's potential here, is to say, what if instead of looking at groups and cohorts, we really looked at individual kids and said, we now have the ability to predict whether Johnny Smith is on a trajectory to be college and career ready by the time he's 18. Okay, and so what we want to do is make sure schools are accountable for keeping him on that trajectory. So each and every kid has some kind of growth variable that they are expected to hit, that their school's expected to hit. And so if Johnny is in fourth grade and is already 3 grade levels behind, that means his school's got to really, get him accelerated towards that goal. At that point, trying to do annual goals for cohorts of kids and subgroups of kids just doesn't make sense. It's just a totally different model. What you'd want to see is, to what degree are the kids in the state of Colorado on track for college and career readiness by 18? It's a totally different mindset. And so what I worry about is that, again, by putting in some of these constraints, which, they make sense for the old system, might be hemming us in for what could become the new system. It's not as big a problem when you're doing it administratively because, we could keep tweaking it. If something like that goes into law, then we're back in the same problem we've got with No Child Left Behind, is that we're frozen in time from 2001.
I mean, I think that there again, you're just wrong. We did not reject we think that Colorado is also a model for the nation in terms of innovating in that space that you're describing. Their system, as we approved it, is very much grounded in that concept that at the individual student basis, it's about, are they on track to college and career readiness? Many of the other states also adopted that principle, but I do think Colorado took it to a much higher level than other states did. Their system for identifying, supporting, intervening in schools is very much driven by not that, but another level of innovation, which is really trying to create a system of continuous improvement by giving people information about how a school is doing, how a subgroup is doing, how a student is doing relative to similarly situated students, schools, subgroups, districts, states, and trying to drive change and progress by looking at relative performance. But that doesn't mean there isn't also a role for keeping an eye on, well, are you, in doing that, are you actually making a difference from year to year? Or, if this year, if you've only got 60% of your students at proficiency level or at college and career readiness, how is that relative to how you were doing 3 years ago? It's effective management, really, to look at different cuts of progress, and we think that's again something that's really something that should be celebrated in this process. Is NCLB had just one cut at progress. It's like, are you marching towards the 100% goal over some predetermined period of time, and didn't give you a chance to look at growth and gain and progress, not just within the individual student, but to a certain extent, you have to have mechanisms for rolling it up, right? If we just said, okay, the goal is every individual student needs to get to college and career readiness. Well, that's great. That should be the foundation of the system. But then how do we roll that information up to decide whether the subgroup's getting better, the school's getting better, the district's getting better, the state's getting better? Colorado, from the very beginning, had a proposal that merged these different lenses on progress into one system, and we did work with them to say, well, if you only look at it from a normative perspective, if you're only trying to beat the average, how do we know that those goals are going to be aggressive? Because there could be a point of time where just beating the average means effectively no progress. So we worked with them to identify progress goals related on marching towards closing gaps is what they did, not towards an absolute 2020 or 2014 goal. So again, that's not where we rejected their frame. We said, we want to enable you to keep your frame. Let's just talk together about mechanisms for ensuring that in keeping your frame that we can say to the world that it's rigorous and that kids won't be lost in the shuffle. And we worked with them on a methodology of doing that, and they made changes based on our input, but we didn't dictate changes. We said, let's work together.
They made changes based on our input. We're still using soft verbs here, but okay. Jeremy, aren't you also trying to have it both ways, sort of celebrating
Probably
diversity
so, yes.
and at the same time demanding that the department hold their feet to the fire and make them all achieve the goals of No Child Left Behind? And in your wildest dreams, do you think they can monitor 50 states with individual, separate, diverse accountability systems?
So let's start with the last.
Have you ever worked at the U.S. Department of Education?
So at the last piece, I'm willing to place some money on Carmel and some of her folks.
And she may be immortal.
At the risk of sounding obsequious. So I think it's a live question about how is it that you're going to monitor and oversee 50 different systems. But on some level, they do that already, right? On a number of indicators in current law. So I think the question is to not sort of solve this by philosophy or belief, but to take it 1 year at a time, one step at a time, and to base it on evidence. So let's see how well you do after a year. And it's incumbent upon outside groups to sort of hold their feet to the fire as well. So I don't know, Checker. I mean, I think it's a legitimate question, but to me it's only really interesting once we really get into it and see how they actually do.
Michelle, haven't a few states declared that they're not going to apply? I think I've read this about Pennsylvania and California, for example.
Yeah, as of right now, they're not going to apply.
As of right now.
Because as you know, there's a
third round
in September, so there could always be a change of heart, a change of political will, who knows. But yeah, and I think there's different things going on in different states. California next week is their state board of education is going to consider a request by superintendent, the state chief there, Torlakson. He kind of wants to have his plan. I think the department's always said that, there's plan A, and that's you follow the law. There's your plan B, which is the waiver, and then that there is no plan C. Well, California plans to wants its own plan C. California is going to, at least the board next week, is going to consider applying outside of the waiver process for some relief under No Child Left Behind. Specifically, they want freedom from SES, tutoring, and choice. They want some freedom to do some of their own things with accountability, but yet they don't want to quite do what the department has asked. So if the board says go ahead, it'll be interesting to see what the department's response to that would be. And then Texas, I think there's philosophical, political things going on in Texas. Pennsylvania, I don't actually know. I haven't checked in on them lately.
They have requested flexibility. So there is a plan C, first of all.
What is plan C?
So
you're talking California
I would say there's a plan C and a plan D. I mean, so you.
I was just quoting. Department
I know, but
earlier.
I guess first of all, there is an alternative. First of all, it's fine if states don't apply, right? Like, this isn't something we're trying to force on states. The contrary, we're trying to give states an opportunity. So I would say that there are, I think, so if you do the math, there's 38, then there's another set that have indicated an intent to apply in September. So there's a handful of states that have not said one way or the other. It's not that they've said that they're not going to apply. I don't think Pennsylvania has said they're not going to apply. They were actually looking for an alternative to our Plan C, which is you could ask for an AMO freeze for a year while you work on a more robust new accountability
And you all have offered
system.
up some
But you
version
have
of
to
that recently.
say, but that Plan C is that you will apply for a waiver. You can only ask for that freeze if you're going to apply for a waiver.
But it is an alternative. It is another mechanism, and
there are
and that is
conditions
something.
tied to your
Yes.
So,
So
it's
it's
not
just
like a free pass.
Yeah, it's just a third option that gives. It's designed for states that don't want to stick with current law, but they're not ready yet with a comprehensive. These are difficult questions, particularly because we are giving states so much freedom to shape it in their own context. So some states may want more time. The states that are applying now, they're trying to catch the identification window of this summer in order to put in place the new system in the 12-13 school year. So there's a little bit of a time clock that doesn't have anything to do with us. It has to do with the way schools work. So there's some states that might want a new system, but they just feel like they can't do it well or do what they need to do in their own state context and deal with that window. So for those states, we have offered that if they're willing to meet some more minimal standards, that they can freeze their AMOs, which is their performance target trajectory under current law, and then work on a plan and come in later. And then I would also say that that a legitimate option is to not apply because perhaps you want to wait for Congress to act, or perhaps you're fine with the current law construct. So I just want to emphasize that from where we sit, that's not a bad result, because our objective is not to get everybody to reject current law. Our objective is to give states the opportunity to move beyond current law when they're doing the next generation of reform, when they're doing even better things for kids.
We're gonna come back to Congress in a minute, and I want everybody to be prepared to answer the following question. Hasn't the waiver process reduced the pressure on Congress to reauthorize the Elementary Secondary Education Act? So we'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to ask first about differentiated accountability. Jeremy mentioned earlier that there was sort of some central principles in NCLB, such as subgroup performance and all kids. I thought one of the central principles in NCLB was all schools that aren't performing satisfactorily have to get intervened in some way with a whole cascade of interventions. The department seems to think that 5% or 10% of the schools need to get intervened in.
That's inaccurate. I think that's inaccurate, but go ahead, I'm sorry.
So where did that come from? Is that not violating a central precept of NCLB? And for Carmel, where on earth did reward schools come from in the statute? I don't remember that.
Yeah, sure. I can
Is
tell
it
you.
there?
1117.
Yeah.
Section
Okay.
1117.
I'm old, I forget. But where did differentiated accountability says we're going to just worry about some of our schools?
So first of all, I want to say, and I'm not to be a lackey of the administration in any way, but
You would never be accused of that.
Yeah, exactly right. That's inaccurate. So I was looking at it again on the way over here. So in the waiver application, you have to not only address sort of these really low performing schools we call priority schools, and these schools with big achievement gaps that we call focus schools, but you're supposed to produce a plan for helping every single Title I school, at least, because that's what federal law has jurisdiction over. Or where it's relevant, is every Title I school has to have help in some way or another. If anything, it was really, really broad, and I'm sure there's some groups that are concerned about how broad it might be. So it was incredible flexibility to states to say you have to address every single one of your Title I, your low-income schools. So one, I think that's inaccurate. Now, I cannot speak for the department about the genesis of this 5 or 10% or anything like that, but I think folks are legitimately worried about how is it that you sort of target particular actions to schools that are really struggling, and how is it that you sort of provide enough flexibility to some schools that maybe are not struggling as much. That's exactly what states have been asking for, right? We can't treat all schools exactly the same. You don't know exactly what the solutions are for every single school that's low performing. So let's give you some differentiation or some flexibility. You can argue about what's the right percentage or anything like that, but it seems to me this idea of giving some schools some flexibility and some differentiation is the way the field has been moving.
I'm just asking whether a basic principle of NCLB is all schools. and whether the waiver process violates that principle.
Oh, again, that's why. Well,
So the answer is yes. A fundamental principle of NCLB is all schools, and the waiver process does not violate that principle. And the very first set of parameters, to use Mike's terminology.
Thank you.
The very first
Tweet that.
parameter under that section of the flexibility request says, tell us how you're going to create a system of support and intervention for all your schools. And then it lays out some additional parameters that say, but show us how, just like NCLB does, show us how you are differentiating the schools that are in most chronic failure, right? Under NCLB, the terminology is restructuring, and the test for that is that you have failed AYP
For multiple
year after
years.
year.
Yeah.
So we are giving them flexibility around AYP, so they need to come up with a new set of identifying who are your schools in greatest crisis. Likewise, NCLB asks them to identify schools that are failing particular groups of students, and they have AYP defines that. So we're saying we need you to continue to show that you are having a focus on gaps. So even if the school's not in crisis, it's actually could be a fairly well-performing school. If you have one of the largest gaps in performance in the state, then show us how you are giving those schools special attention. And basically, it's an attempt to give states more flexibility around how they create portfolios of schools and prioritize those in the greatest need. And, where did it come from? We worked closely with chief state school officers and other stakeholders in the education arena. And, we did not get a lot of objection to that criteria. It made sense to people that you would find a way to prioritize schools in crisis and schools that, although seemingly well-performing, that were missing the mark for particular groups of students, that made sense to these states, and that's where it came from. The reward school is something the Secretary feels really strongly about. It is in the law. It's in 1117. I helped put it there, so I'm positive it's there.
You can cite the provision. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And, I think from the Secretary's experience as a person who was in charge of a school system, he just felt really strongly that one of the weaknesses of NCLB was that nobody paid attention to that provision of the law. And so the law became very much about how to label as failures schools and how to punish them. And he just feels really strongly that an effective accountability system, an effective management system, needs to include this concept that when you do well, you should be celebrated. And if you only look at the negative and you don't look at the positive, you're just not going to have an effective system. So we gave states a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of how they operationalize that concept, but we asked them to include that concept.
Okay, would either of you like to talk about differentiated accountability before I turn to the congressional question and then to the audience?
I just want to quickly say I do think how districts, states, we're going to look at that other 85% of schools, those not in the very bottom. I think that was, and Jeremy, I know you analyzed these, so was a weak part of their applications. This was another opportunity for states to unleash that creativity. And I don't know if it was a problem in articulation, but I thought it was a weak part. And the department did come back and ask for more details on that. So yes, they are supposed to differentiate accountability and focus on all schools, but I don't think they did a particularly good job articulating how they would do it.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to see how this plays out. I mean, remember that one of the problems that people identified in No Child Left Behind was that it labels decent schools as failing schools sometimes, because a few kids missed the mark. It didn't distinguish between the really bad schools and the so-so schools. So we'll see. I mean, I think, in the states that have the A to F ratings, if those ratings come out right, some of those schools now, instead of being labeled failing under No Child Behind, will be labeled a C school or a D school. And now I think where we as policy wonks are still struggling and want to have it both ways is we're saying, well, even if you're now just a C school, we still want the state to intervene in you in certain ways. I'm skeptical that states have the capacity to do that, but also how is that going to play? Does that still look like the school and the people working in it still feel like they're being shamed in some way for working in a bad school? And that, I'm just saying, I don't know that that's the case, but I think we have to see how that plays out. And what we need to recognize is that there are trade-offs here. We don't want to give up on this idea of subgroup accountability and the idea that we're going to tell schools that if one of your subgroups is not performing well, you're a bad school, while at the same time we acknowledge that that's not totally fair to the school. I think there's just this internal conflict. So it's still a muddle.
So I would love if that's true, Mike, that we don't want to give up on subgroup accountability, but I sat through a markup and a debate in the House Education and Workforce Committee last week where the proposal was to not require states, or it would not require states to include subgroup accountability in their accountability systems. So I don't think we should pretend that there's not a movement afoot to back off or roll back sort of the protections we have for kids, particularly subgroups of kids. But I hope you're right that a majority, at least, of Americans are there. I think so. The public is there. So, I mean, again, I hope you're right. Second of all, this myth that, not to be like the defender of NCLB, but there's nowhere in the law it says that a school is labeled as failing, right? I mean, I know there's maybe semantics.
Use the word failing.
Right.
In need of improvement. But I think, and Andy Rotherham said this, so maybe in a state, 50 or 60% of their schools really do need improvement. They have set so many of their N sizes so high so that it's not 1 or 2 kids that's causing a school to not do well. It's 40 or 50 kids, and usually there are multiple subgroups. So in the Washington Post last year, I'll finish with this, had a story about a suburban school, I think in Montgomery County, and the principal said, oh, this is so awful because it's a couple of our students with disabilities that cause us to be labeled as in need of improvement. Thanks to NCLB and the law we had, our friends at the Education Trust went and analyzed the data, and lo and behold, it wasn't just kids with disabilities. It was their English language learners and their low-income students. And when you realize that you have to have 50 or 60 students in each of those groups, that's a significant chunk in a school. So does that school need to improve? Absolutely. Do they need to do the exact same things that a school that's in crisis needs to do? Absolutely not. But there's these myths and this bad rap about federal law that's out there that's, I think, driving some of the rhetoric that's really not very helpful and winds up sort of backing off on the protections that we have for kids.
All right. Well, and I used to make those.
Not you, Mike Matilli. Not you,
look,
Mike.
and I've made that argument. I know that argument. I think we have to pay attention to the reality that many educators feel demoralized by those labels, even if they don't use the word failing. So again,
fair enough, Mike.
Let's see how this plays out. I do hope that if those schools aren't called failing anymore, but they're called C schools or D schools, we'll see how if that doesn't sting quite as much, or it stings just the right amount.
So, Jeremy, the first part of your comment was the perfect segue into my next and possibly
You're
last
welcome.
question. When you began to beat up on the House Education Committee for the direction it wants to go with reauthorization, at least the majority on the current majority on the House Education Committee wants to go with reauthorization. I mean, it's obvious to all of us that Congress has been in no rush to reach agreement on a reauthorization. It's equally obvious to all of us that current law needs reauthorizing in the worst way. Here's my question. If the waiver process is putting ample grease on the squeaking wheel, why is Congress, which has many other problems and challenges and issues on its plate, why are they going to turn to reauthorization in my lifetime?
Yeah, I don't think they have any reason to anymore. I think that in the department, I think, in all due respect, has been somewhat disingenuous about this. I mean, there was a live proposal out of the Senate that passed in a bipartisan way out of committee, and that had some momentum. And the department made it very clear that they opposed that bill. And my sense is the department looks at the facts and says, hey, we would prefer to have our model around waivers because that's closer to our policy preferences than to see Congress actually go through with the reauthorization in the direction it was heading, which would have provided more flexibility around all these issues we're talking about today. And so while the department may have started the waiver process to help prod the Congress, and because Congress couldn't come to agreement, I think there was a moment, last fall when it looked like things were happening. And I still think if you took that Senate bill that passed out of committee and now the House bill that passed out of committee, you could find a compromise. It would look a lot like Lamar Alexander's bills, I think, that could easily pass Congress and that the president would sign. But the Department of Education has decided it doesn't want to do that because it's not, in line with its preferences as much as the waiver thing is. So I think the administration's made a clear decision that they don't want Congress to reauthorize the law anytime soon because they won't get what they want.
Go ahead.
So I disagree. We are not being disingenuous. I think the reason that I know that, and maybe Mike doesn't, is because I have accompanied Arnie Duncan on the hundreds of trips to Capitol Hill to work on a reauthorization before we unveiled our blueprint, which, by the way, we did in March of 2010. So this is, and the law at that point was already several years overdue.
Right. That's when there were the Democrats controlled both chambers of Congress. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, your team. Yeah.
We have always approached this in a very bipartisan way. We did not ask our team to move a bill. We asked Congress in a bipartisan way to move bipartisan legislation. We have been very committed to that. We remain committed to that. When we went and unveiled our blueprint in March of 2010, we had already spent months working with bipartisan, bicameral group of folks from Congress on what a new ESEA should look like. And then, Arnie Duncan has spent an amazing amount of time and effort to try to move that process forward. He still is spending time and effort to move that process forward. If it moves forward, we will welcome it. I think Mike's right. There was some movement this year. We were happy to see it. We did not oppose the HELP committee bill. We expressed concerns about some aspects of that bill, but we did not oppose it. We would definitely work with them moving forward. We're very troubled by the action in the House because it was not bipartisan. It was partisan. We were happy with the bipartisan action in the Senate, but we're not seeing that from the House. And, I think at the end of the day, Congress should still move forward because this flexibility package does not fully reauthorize the law. There's more work to be done. We think they should do that work. We stand ready to help them to do that work, but we won't accept any bill. The president is looking for a good bipartisan bill in this space. I think, basically what we tried to do is thread the needle. We appreciated the implications of the flexibility package on the legislative process. I spent 10 years of my career in the Senate. I appreciate the implications of it for them. But on the other hand, we had chiefs and parents and principals and teachers who, when I started working for Arnie Duncan in January of 2009, started asking us for waivers of the law. So we had waited a significant amount of time. We had demonstrated partnership with Congress in an effort to move forward. We remain ready to continue to be partners with them in that effort. But Arnie Duncan is not a D.C. guy, right? He's a Chicago guy. He's a former.
Then he should just kneecap them.
He's a former superintendent. He knows what it was like to live on the other end of the law, and it was difficult for him to hold off as long as he did, and he tried to do that in a way that was respectful to Congress. But the clamor that we received for, this was a question for Michelle earlier, for some common sense relief so that folks could move forward with the next generation of reform was very substantial, and we're trying to work in partnership with people who work in schools every day, while we also continue to work in partnership with members of the Congress.
Okay,
so,
Michelle,
Checker, didn't you answer your own question?
Michelle first, because she's the closest thing we have up here to a neutral observer of the process. Has this reduced the likelihood of congressional action?
So I don't really enjoy trying to
Predict the Congress. I know, it's an election year, too.
Inside the heads of those in Congress, but no, I don't really think. I think Congress is operating on its own trajectory. I do think waivers may shape things going forward. I think the waivers are almost kind of the new floor, and I think some key battles were decided in waivers. I think traditional subgroups, an emphasis on traditional subgroups. That's something that's the trajectory. Where it's going away. I think a key battle was lost in keeping SES in choice. So I think waivers shift the tone a bit, or will definitely influence reauthorization going forward. When that happens, after the election, who knows? I mean, we could have a totally different executive branch, and then who knows what will happen to waivers then. But so I don't really think they affected things that much, but I think they could going forward.
Jeremy, I interrupted you.
No, I just thought you had an interesting question. I mean, I thought it was easier than I thought it was going to be. Or I mean, you just said why hasn't Congress acted? And I think
I
that is
asked
the
with
question.
the squeaking wheel having been greased by
Right.
the waiver process,
Right.
is the Congress now less likely to act?
Right. So was that disingenuous then when members of Congress said that some of them said that they were sort of ticked off about the waivers? I mean, if Mr. Klein in the House really wanted to move a bill, why didn't he work with Mr. Miller? So why didn't the Republicans and Democrats work together? So, and I'm not blaming that particular person, but there was a lot of talk about, we don't like the waivers, but why then hasn't there been a greater push? I think that your question then is fair. So on some level, I maybe that's a obscure way of saying I don't think the waivers have pulled off that much. Certainly some, but I don't know that it's pulled off that much, because anytime that the members really want a bipartisan bill, they could move forward if they want to.
All right, well, and that's true. I mean, let me ask Carmel. So let's say that the House bill goes to the floor, it gets passed on a party line vote. You now have a bill ready to go to conference. Would you encourage Senator Harkin to move his bill to the floor of the Senate to get that passed so that we could then have a bipartisan conference committee and hash this out? What's wrong with that?
I mean, first of all, it's not for me to tell Senator Harkin what to do. But
He'd welcome your advice,
yeah,
however.
I mean, what we have said as an administration is that we would welcome forward movement on the reauthorization as long as it was good for kids and it was bipartisan. So I think the dilemma here, and this is what Senator Harkin has said for himself, nothing to do with me, is that he's concerned that the level of partisanship that's happening in the House and the content of the bill. So I think we have to respect his prerogative as the chairman in the Senate to decide whether to move forward with his bill or not. But we're hopeful that folks will. We think it is. Senator Harkin and Senator Enzi demonstrated that getting a bipartisan bill is possible in this space. So we would urge the Congress to move forward in that fashion.
I would think if the president picked up the phone and talked to his former colleague Senator Harkin and said, move the bill so we can get this to conference committee and get this done, he would probably do so. So I think that is something the administration could do if it wanted to, and I think it'll have an opportunity shortly, because I think the House will pass this bill on the floor, and then we could be steps away from a conference committee and from a reauthorization.
On the other side, don't you think there are also some folks who are waiting to see if they shake out better in the election? So there's certainly probably some Republicans who are thinking,
not.
if we do better, then we'll get more control. So I think
most Republicans after the last couple of months don't have too much hope for that. So,
okay, I've been monopolizing all of you. The audience has been very patient. There might be questions in the studio audience, and there might be questions coming in through the internet. The floor is open. Fritz, do they have to speak into mics so that you can get them to the universe? He's pretty loud even without a mic.
Fritz Edelstein, Public-Private Action. We've raised the issue, especially Mike and Jeremy, about innovation. And so use the words creativity, imagination, innovation. What do you think the reason was for the lack of it within the states? Fear? They're not ready to get to that, or they didn't have enough time, or they're just not used to it? And what does that then speak to for what needs to be in future ESEA legislation?
And this is for Mike and Jeremy?
And
maybe they were just born without an innovation gene.
Right. Look, I think, first of all, the department was clear in the original application that it wasn't open to just anything. And so there were some parameters put in. I think if you look at what states have done in their own accountability systems, there has been some innovation. I mean, personally, I like the Florida system, for example, A to F, focus on low achievers, not explicitly race-based, but getting at the same principle of subgroups through another means. And Colorado, as we've talked about, individual student growth, getting to college and career readiness. So I think those are important examples of innovation. And I think what we've heard from Carmel is, okay, they didn't get rejected entirely, but they were asked to make some changes. And you can argue the merits of that. I think in the end, that means that their systems now are more complex and convoluted than they otherwise would be. But it's good that they're now going to have at least one accountability system and not two.
I just have to weigh in to say I think there was some comments about the states not being innovative in the Bush administration flexibility initiatives, which I have not articulated an opinion about. But there was innovation here. Read these applications. I know they're hard to read, as Michelle said. We have some 1-2 page summaries for each state. They're on our website. Read them. Read the work that EdTrust just did this week. They did a little bit longer summaries, but still digestible summaries. There's a tremendous amount of innovation in these applications. No two states did the same thing. Some of the innovations, just to tick them off, because Checker's going to cut me off, is
because you interrupted Jeremy.
There's huge innovation, as Mike said, around looking at the issue of growth and progress. We talked about Colorado. Massachusetts is not just looking at are you getting students from, underperforming or not proficient to proficient. They said, are you also getting students to advanced levels of performance? Didn't happen under NCLB because you didn't get any credit for it. Massachusetts is doing that. The other thing that's a really interesting innovation, and this speaks to something Mike mentioned earlier, is several of these states don't ask the state to intervene in the C schools. They have set up a much more sophisticated system of district level accountability. In Massachusetts, districts also get grades, and your grade can be no higher than your lowest performing school in your district. That is a huge motivating force for those superintendents to get those schools to get better. In Tennessee, their entire system is trying to move away from the idea that the state is responsible for all the schools in the state, and instead they've adopted a much more aggressive responsibility around their lowest chronically underperforming schools, and they turned them over to a new ASD, a new school district that's run at the state level. But for the vast majority of their schools, they're stepping back and they're saying, no, we are going to hold our districts responsible for how their schools are doing. So there's some, we didn't really get into the substance to the level that I would have liked to have gotten into with respect to these applications, but I just urge you all to look at them because there's a tremendous amount of innovation and it's really exciting stuff.
So did you say Massachusetts was the place where the district's grade cannot be higher than its lowest performing school's grade?
Yes. Yeah, and other states did put in place new and interesting and more aggressive accountability mechanisms at the district level. New Jersey, on the other hand, didn't rely very heavily on their districts. New Jersey's system is sort of founded on the principle, the theory of action, that they're going to create these regional entities that are going to provide support to directly to their schools. And the really very innovative thing they're doing is they're developing at the student level a college and career readiness report. So teachers and parents and their students have these reports on their students' progress to college and career readiness. So it's another frame. It's let's get right down to the student. There's some states that are looking much more aggressively at college readiness and career readiness. 6 states look at career readiness explicitly at the secondary school level. In Georgia, they're going to track whether the kids, not just whether they go to college, but whether when they get there, their need for remediation. So, I mean, I could go on and on. There's hundreds of innovations contained in these applications. And, I could tell you all of them, but there's not enough time.
Actually, a useful thing for somebody to do in or out of the government would be to make a kind of list of most interesting innovations in the state flexibility applications. It's a good project for the next annual Education Week Quality Counts. Yes. And put Carmel's assertion to the test. And
I have a PowerPoint, but
with lots of examples on it?
Yes, you wouldn't let me do a PowerPoint, Checker. I would have shared it.
Well, would you come back and do it, and we'll organize another donut session.
We have plenty left, so. And the Krispy Kremes will last, I think,
Jeremy, did you
pretty
want
much
to
forever.
respond to Fritz's
I just
question?
want to say clear that I was not at all saying that states are not innovative at all, so I want to be clear. I just think it's a myth that the federal government is the big boogeyman standing in the way of that. So I would agree around the sort of turning around low-performing schools. Yes, there were some clear principles the department put out there, but some states offered some things in addition to that. Plus the subgroups, regardless of what you think about that, that's an innovation, or a change at least.
Plus, on a practical level, still they had 7 weeks to put together an application. Some of them needed State Board of Education approval. They had to get public comment. So I think some of it might have been a function of time. Not that they shouldn't have been innovative on their own
It'd be interesting
anyway.
to see if the second batch, therefore, which had more time, is
come up
more creative on that front. Behind the post, who are you?
I'm Alexandra Usher from the Center on Education Policy.
We've heard of it.
My question is about, I guess, the follow-through of the waiver, the implementation of all the things that states have laid out in their applications. And I guess my understanding is that if they are unable for any reason or unwilling to kind of actually implement all these things, that the waivers can then be not revoked, but that the states would be subject to the law as it stands. And I guess what kind of time frame would you be looking at to ensure that states start moving forward with these things? And if a state, for example, is kind of implementing, say they put together a great new accountability system, but they aren't following through with other aspects of their waiver plan, would they then have to kind of undo that and recalculate everything according to NCLB law?
So this is a monitoring and accountability question for the states for Carmel. There is a little bit of a context here that I think is just worth putting on the table, which is that states made a lot of promises in their race to the top applications of things they were going to do, and some of them have had trouble doing some of those things. And a fair number of them have come back for permission to take longer or do it differently. Do you not suppose that something of the sort is going to happen with regard to the waivers as well?
Yes, I mean, someone made the comment earlier that monitoring or the 50 different visions of accountability means a lot more work for us. That's absolutely true. We own that, and we are not relying on Carmel Martin to make sure that that goes well. We're working to build capacity. You know, people talk about the lack of capacity at the state and local level around school improvement all the time, but it's an issue at the federal level as well. We need to think differently. We need to retool the way we're organized. We are doing that. Happy to share more details about that if anybody's interested in boring bureaucratic topics like that. But we have made very clear that if states don't follow through and don't protect kids, that we will revoke the waiver. The waivers, by definition, are temporary in nature. They last 2 years. Or if Congress comes in with a reauthorization, that would also end the waivers. We do see historically examples of, for example, welfare reform, where HHS gave waivers to states to do things differently, and even when the legislation was passed, they were grandfathered in, so that's a possibility, but our presumption and the state's presumption is that Congress move forward. It would trump the waiver. We stand ready to revoke them, but obviously we're not hoping for that result. We do plan to approach it similar to how we've approached it in Race to the Top, where also the Secretary has made clear that he will revoke a grant if they don't do follow through on the commitments that they made. But we do want to approach this in a new way than has been true for the Department of Education, and not approach, if they have to make changes because it makes sense to make changes, we, like in Race to the Top, we want to work with them on that. It's not a cookie cutter approach. So as they move forward with implementation, if there's a need to modify their plans, then we will entertain those and try to work with states to move forward. But we won't compromise the core principles. We won't compromise protecting the things we have asked for that we think will protect kids and give us the ability to say that the result will be better for kids. The first opportunity that we'll have to interact with states on an implementation front will be once they identify schools in this late spring, early summer. We're going to look at whether in doing that they did what they said, and it looks like kids are being protected in their new model as we expected it to be. We are going to do on-site visits in every state before the beginning of the next school year. So we are planning on having a much more robust monitoring but also support approach in this context than has historically been the case for the department, which means a ton of work, but work we think is worth doing.
I'm sure Michelle and Jeremy are going to be monitoring on your behalf also, as they, and probably the Center for Education Policy and Ed Trust and 6 or 8 other organizations looking. And
we welcome that. We want other stakeholders to take responsibility for ensuring that things are going well for kids.
And we're going to send Mike out to visit in person every state that got a waiver and check on their veracity. Is there another question in the room? Anybody? Also behind the pillar. Yeah. I can't even see you.
Sorry.
Who are you?
Dylan Scott with Governing Magazine. I had a conversation recently with just a on-the-ground school superintendent, and he raised a point that I wanted to pose to you all. Obviously, the waivers require a significant amount of commitment and effort to implement, and he was concerned that depending on the political situation and how long it takes for reauthorization could differ significantly from the waiver process, and that would mean, in a year or two or however long, states and school districts would have to significantly shift direction again, and obviously they're working with limited resources. So I guess I'm wondering, is that a legitimate concern? If so, how can that be addressed, or is it just kind of a gamble that states have to take in applying for waivers?
Well, I think Carmel's already said that in the department's view, reauthorization would trump the waivers, unless the waivers got grandfathered into the reauthorization or something like that.
Yeah, regardless of Carmel's view, it would be the law, right? So I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something that states have to think about, and it might very well be the thing that's driving the handful of states that have indicated that they're not going to apply. I mean, it's a rational perspective. I guess what we're not finding that it's a big concern of the states we're working with right now, and I think the reason it's not a big concern for them is, first and foremost, we're letting them do what they want to do. I mean,
they don't expect reauthorization to ever happen.
Well, that might be very true. I mean, I don't think it's about the fact that we're doing waivers, but I think there's a sense out in the country that Congress is not functioning the way we would hope it would function. It's not moving forward, not just with education, but lots of legislation. So I think part of their calculus could be they're gambling that it's unlikely that Congress will move forward. But I actually think it's not that. I think it's that we are giving them sufficient. I obviously disagree with Mike. I think we're giving them the space to do what they want to do. The chief state school officers sent us a letter before we started this process, and they said, we want reauthorization to happen, but if you move forward with a flexibility initiative, here are the principles we are volunteering to abide by, and those principles track pretty closely to what we laid out as our principles. And I'm not saying there aren't things that states wanted to do that we told them we can't go that far in this process. But I think if you talk to those chiefs and you talk to the states that we've worked with so far, they're not worried about reauthorization because they feel like they've got a system that they believe in and they've got stakeholder buy-in to, and they want to move forward with it. I think they would oppose legislation that would prevent them from doing what they're doing under the flexibility package, and that's fair. That's like their prerogative to do that.
And but most likely, if legislation does go through, it will provide greater flexibility. I mean, certainly the Harkin-Enzi bill would have provided greater flexibility, and certainly the Klein bill. And so the center of gravity in Congress would allow for more
Waivers,
flexibility,
waivers
innovation, whatever you want to call it, rolling back, whatever you choose your adjective or noun, and verb.
Or verb.
Or verb. Thank you.
But it'd be an interesting question. What if the flip worked? And I'm not coming at this thinking this is how it should be, but what if reauthorization takes a while, and what if you have these waivers going into effect for 2 years, including in Minnesota, including in Iowa, including in oh my goodness, I'm blanking, but the states obviously of the members in Wyoming, and although Wyoming hasn't applied, and not California. But wouldn't it be interesting to see if the states, the work that's happening through the waivers in the states will create pressure in the reverse on Congress to make sure that what they're doing is not getting in the way of the waivers, so that you're not sort of frustrating your superintendents? It's a theoretical question.
No, it's not. It's consistent with my earlier question about whether the pressure is actually off Congress to reauthorize. You're asking a version of the same question, which is, will a reauthorization in effect grandfather in all the waivers in order to not create the kind of disruption in state practice that his on-the-ground superintendent was apprehensive about? And I think it's. I would guess that if 40 states have waivers, by the time reauthorization takes place, if it ever takes place, that there will be lots of pressure on lots of members of Congress to not make them go back to the drawing boards and start over again at the state level, or phase in whatever is new about reauthorization and phase out whatever is in the waivers, something that will not cause an abrupt stop-start. That'd be my hunch. Anybody else in the room? We have one softball question over the internet. That's
it's probably from my mother, who's watching at home.
I'll bet not, actually.
No?
Though I don't know your mother, and
Where'd that
she
handsome
might
suit
be
come
inclined in this direction. But the question says the best people to hold accountable for improving student performance are the parents. How does this fit into the waivers and reauthorization process?
It doesn't. Right. I mean, right. I have empathy for that comment. Nobody's figured out, I think, at the state, federal, local level, any real policies to try to find a way to change parent behavior in a significant way. And it may we have to admit that that's beyond the scope of what public policy can do. I think individual schools can find ways to get parents involved, and as well as sign contracts and make expectations clear. But I think that's a whole other set of activities to think about, and I think it's going to be hard for the government to do that. It's going to mostly have to be a private sector, social service sector kind of thing.
Okay, we got one more question in the room, and then we are going to have to quit, though people can take donuts or linger with their donuts. Go ahead. Who are you?
I'm Iris Bond-Gill with the Campaign for High School Equity. And I kind of wanted to build off of that question about parents, only maybe a little bit in the reverse. Jeremy, earlier you talked about how some of the waivers and the new accountability systems that the states have a lot of indicators. And so there are a number of indicators. I read the Georgia application, and it's very complex to look at a report card that has a number of flags, a number of indicators. And so how will these states be able to communicate this information to parents so that parents are able to both understand and process it, and not just parents, but teachers and community advocates and others who are in that role of being able to help hold schools accountable for educating kids. So are the states in any way that you're aware of required to, or are they at least talking about creating materials that may be user-friendly for parents, or in some way helping to explain how the new accountability systems will work?
Anybody?
Yeah, so the peer reviewers actually expressed a lot of concern about the fact that as states were moving to much more complex and sophisticated accountability systems, that it would be harder for parents and the public to dissect them. So we did ask states to address that, not by changing the complexity of their system, but by talking about how they would help key stakeholders in their state to understand how their system works. I mean, some of it is, particularly if you look at something like Colorado, you really need to be a psychometrician to fully comprehend what they're doing.
Lord save us.
But I do think there's a way for parents to understand. I mean, it's just like A through F for your kids in school. You don't understand every component that goes into them getting an A grade versus an F grade, but you understand in principle what stands behind those grades. And then, as Jeremy pointed out earlier, at the end of the day, it's an easier system for parents to understand than other systems, including AYP. So we think that the issue you're identifying is a real one. We did ask states to take on the responsibility of making sure key stakeholders understood their systems. We also are working with outside organizations as they move forward to do that work on behalf of the public and states. For example, as I mentioned, EdTrust put out some stuff today. We're sort of welcoming the opportunity to use our expertise to help external organizations translate the applications for the public, because we think it's an important thing to do. We're trying to do it ourselves with our short summaries, but I don't know that we're fully there either. There's also a continuing obligation for states and districts to publish report cards, and we're hopeful that in that context it will be another opportunity for us to work with states to make sure that the public and parents and communities understand what's in the system.
Certainly one of the advantages of an A through F system about marking schools is that parents will understand that better. I mean, states have come up with an astonishing variety of euphemisms to describe the schools at various levels of performance. In Ohio, for example, one of the terms is continuous improvement. Would you suppose that a school that is called continuous improvement on an A through F system, what grade would you think it's actually getting on the A through F system? Well, that's a C grade, continuous improvement. But what is a parent to think when they see that their school is continuous improvement? I'm not sure that communicates what a parent might most want to know about their school. I believe we are out of time. Please join me in thanking our panel today.